Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are looking at the Recce platoon. So we have looked at the anti-tank options available to people. We have looked at the forward observer options available to people. We have not looked at standard infantry units or officers, mostly because we're going to save those for the rifle platoon. Similarly, we are saving transports for the rifle platoon because there's a lot of different ways to break things down, and mostly I'm just buying time until we see the Soviet book drop. That's all. Because the Soviet book, I think, is going to also give us a little bit of clarity on a specific kind of transport that I would like to know what the official thing is. On account of that, kind of gives us a trickle down for other stuff later. So suffice it to say, I do think, however, that we do have enough to be able to assess the qualities of the Recce platoon, similar to how we did for the artillery and engineering platoons. We're going to take a look at these. And then when we're getting ready to do the rifle platoon, we'll be looking at the rest of the HQ choices, as well as the infantry choices and the transports. And so you'll see those there. We did assess, light mortars a very long time ago when we first started out the channel. My opinion has more or less not changed on those. So, we have most everything built out here. And obviously for those astute people who are looking at these cool desert SAS style Jeep Rider guys, you can't technically, as of right now, you cannot field these as part of a Recce platoon, but you do kind of get the vibe. And that's the reason why I chose this picture. These are the guys, they're forward operating units who are going ahead, they're scouting out. And so because of that, there are mandatory requirements, including transport capacity within the Army, unless you're running very specific kinds of units like motorcycles and the like. So in terms of what we're going to be looking at, we're going to look at, from a scenario perspective, which ones they tend to perform really well in, which ones a Recce platoon might struggle a little more with. We're going to look at board considerations, considerations regarding terrain and, other factors that may be present on it that a Recce platoon might excel at or might struggle with. We're going to look at deployment considerations, what kinds of matchups among the various different kinds of Army builds they may do well against, and which ones they may struggle a bit with more. We're going to look at what kinds of choices you should be looking at, as well as what nations might benefit more or less from a Recce platoon. We're then going to look at some of the changes that we recommend and that we have made in the Zern mission pack, which you can find on our website at zerncentral.com. And then finally, we're just going to talk on why it matters. Why is it that I'm spending so much time thinking about potential changes to a platoon in a game where, it's not like if we make changes to a Recce platoon, it's going to dramatically improve the standings of one particular nation or, make things a little bit better. And this is one of those platoons where most nations are actually relatively similar. Like there are some differences between them, obviously, mostly as regards what kinds of transports they can get. But in general, a lot of these options are very similar from one nation to the next. And so we'll be discussing that. So to start off with, and it makes sense for scenario considerations, that I would, of course, lead off in this video with my favorite Polish people, because Poland is my main army. In case you're newer to the channel, this is the army that I tend to play most often, and that I'll be taking to a tournament in a couple weeks. First of all, if you're looking at any sort of kill point counting mission, right, a seek and destroy style scenario, Recce platoon is actually a really good choice, in my opinion. It allows you to get submachine gun wielding guys very close to the enemy very quickly. It allows you to get more of them up there more quickly and more effectively because you potentially gain Recce on a number of your transports, which means that you can quite effectively get guys over there without the transport being blown up, which is always nice. And it allows you to be able to better take advantage of the number of turns per game that you are able to shoot with a specific vehicle, with a specific infantry squad, because you had a vehicle that was able to get you up there very quickly. And so because of that, I think it actually does work really well. Combine that with the fact that you are kind of incentivized to take things like motorcycle troops and cavalry troops, which can be very effective at helping you with removing enemy units, especially deep into enemy territory. I think the Recce platoon actually does pretty well, all things considered. You also get easy access to things like forward observers if you have really good forward observers with your Army special rules. It also allows you to take an extra anti-tank team, which in the case of, for example, Japanese, would give you 3 extra anti-tank teams, because 1 slot per platoon, not per force, gets to take that extra selection on their special AT guys. And so only getting 1 in a Recce platoon is honestly not horrible. It works out okay. From an objective controlling standpoint, it's also a pretty good choice, because you can more quickly and more effectively get men onto far-flung objectives. You have more transport probably on the table than you would have otherwise, or more speed on the transport otherwise. But in addition, with the inclusion of a large number of transports, especially the potential for armored transports, as we'll soon see, there's a big reason to take those in this platoon. You get potential cover once you're on those objectives to be able to help protect your men so that you can maintain that objective is yours. And that's just fantastic. So on the whole, you're really investing in units that are going to be well tailored to taking objectives and objective controlling missions. And should you be in one of those objectives where the objective can move because somebody can pick it up and run off with it, Recce platoons are quite nice because they are almost purely centered around maneuverability and speed. And so those will be very effective. And then when we get to maneuver and positioning style scenarios, things like demolition and the like, this is an excellent choice because they will allow you to start getting ready to get to wherever that location is, maneuvering around your opponents in ways that infantry blocks, especially dismounted infantry, have a difficulty in doing. And that is exceptional. Also, in the event that you have mounted up troops that are using those, 25 by 50 millimeter bases or whatever, keep in mind that units that are in a transport will probably have a smaller footprint, right? So while, yes, you can take mounted up troops, on bicycles or motorcycles or horses or whatever, you might find that in a Recce platoon, it's actually better from a maneuvering perspective to put people in a wheeled vehicle than it is to put them on horseback. And so suffice it to say, because of the fact that you get these transports, very often armored transports, often with the Recce special rule, alongside access to more infantry squads, especially if they put a limit of, like, say, 1 rifle platoon maximum for whatever you're doing to meet up with friends or you're going to an event, just because, they want to cut out some of the spam. They don't want to see people running like, 3 dirt cheap rifle platoons alongside 3 armor platoons, or 3 dirt cheap rifle platoons alongside, say, 3 heavy weapons platoons, or something like that. Just cheesing for the order dice. If that's the case, this is the other platoon other than engineers that gives you access to infantry sections, but these infantry sections can be dramatically cheaper than engineering sections because you're not paying the extra point for engineers, and you only have a maximum of 1. We only have a minimum requirement of 1 infantry squad in order to take this platoon. So in general, if you need more infantry, this could also be a great way of doing it. It's also a firepower-centric sort of army, right? It's giving you access to more anti-tank teams. It's giving you access to more observers. So it's providing you with relatively cheap access to firepower specifically. Okay. And this makes for a really nice mix of options. Now, it's not as survivable, sure, as things like an armored platoon, which we'll be talking about in a couple months. It's not even as firepower-centric per se as, say, an artillery platoon, although admittedly, artillery platoons are trading an awful lot of mobility in order to get that firepower. But it provides you with a nice mix, right? It gives you a good reason to take mobile troops, swift-moving troops, and contribute toward that positioning, and hopefully keeping those infantry safer for longer periods of time, more so than a lot of other platoons can do. From a board consideration perspective, you kind of want to board with about medium density cover because, on the one hand, Recce is really effective, especially in a game that doesn't have long range to hit penalties anymore. In the case of 3rd edition, you want to have some cover that can completely obscure line of sight or can get you a nice cover save over and again, something that's really open. At the same time, if it's too dense, one, you might have limitations on how much your mobility actually helps you, because you might not be moving very fast at all, depending on how many pivots and how many turns you need to make with things. And more than that, you want to be able to take advantage of being able to hit enemies as well, right? So you don't want it to be too dense. You also don't want to be too light. Somewhere right in the middle is kind of the ideal spot for this kind of platoon. Keep in mind that since you're also very possibly taking this because of access to forward observers and the like, having direct line of sight to things and being able to contribute line of sight as an indirect fire spotter is also quite useful. And this is why medium density terrain tends to be really effective. You do want to have some open lanes that you can very clearly be able to see down, so that way you can help out the other units as needed for what you're fielding. You want to have kind of deployment behind hard cover as much as you can for pretty much all of these units. Not necessarily in hard cover, because, for example, a cavalry unit would only be able to advance to get out of it unless you had fieldcraft on that unit, which on turn 1, some nations do, which is really nice. You also obviously wouldn't want to start a wheeled transport or something like that in hardcover because it wouldn't be able to move at all. I'm not even sure you'd be able to make that placement as a legal placement because it's not allowed to move in it. So, but making sure that you're behind stone walls, that you're, 50% or more behind ruins or buildings or things like that. You want hardcover protecting you. And then you want firing lanes. You want to be able to, from a place of safety, be able to fire at the enemy. So in general, and you'll find this quite commonly, ruins and stone walls tend to be the things you want the most, right? Those tend to be the things that are most effective on a map. You want a mix of, different types of defenses, buildings, ruins, force. That way you can maximize your ability to escape behind stuff while also having a certain amount of open space, right, as we've talked about. And most importantly, perhaps, because of the fact that you're investing so much of your points into mobility, roads become extremely helpful. Whether you're taking motorcycle troops as your infantry, whether you're taking wheeled vehicles or half-track vehicles as your transport units, it can be extremely useful to have roads. Now, that being said, not all transports are wheeled or half-tracked. You do have tracked transports, and if you're taking those, then suddenly roads become a lot more optional, right? Because tracked vehicles don't take advantage of it. But if you're looking for the best benefits for you, in an ideal world, you would plan around there being roads, and there would actually be roads. In terms of deployment considerations, in general, I tend to deploy my transports last. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, because I can go down with all the units that are inside the transport first, right? I don't need to do any of those up front. I might drop a unit or two just so that, the opponent has something to place their deployment around, there's something to base things on, because I'm not a jerk, right? There's only 2 or 3 places I'm probably going to deploy an artillery piece. There's only 2 or 3 places I'm going to deploy a mortar, especially if that mortar is inexperienced and doesn't have a spotter working with him. And so because of that, place some stuff down, but in general, keep the transport itself for last. And the reason why is because you want to know where the most effective places are for going with that transport based on what's inside of it. And 2, you want to know where the things are that are going to potentially try to make a trap for your transport. And then map out, after you've placed it, when you're getting ready to place it, map out in your mind where you need it to go so that you have your clear line of movement and mobility that allows you to not waste pivots or anything else like that. Heaven forbid you should have to just do reverse moves or things like that. Because while Recce units are better at doing reverse moves because they move at full speed instead of half speed, at the same time, you don't necessarily want to be using that aspect of Recce, especially in a scenario where you have to move up, right? You want to be using your reverse moves to keep you safe. You don't want to be using them because you misdeployed, right? So think about that and make sure you're planning accordingly. If you have mounted infantry, so, if you have cavalry or motorcycles or bicycles, make sure they're not clogging up your roads, which is not to say don't put them on roads, because bicycles, for example, are wasted points. And actually, they're worse than wasted points because they keep you from doing other things if you don't have them on a road, right? So, keep that in mind. Just keep in mind, do I want my bicycle troops moving up before I move up my half-tracked vehicle or my wheeled vehicle or something else like that? Where do I position them on the road so I'm not clogging it up for the unit that needs to use it? Because you're not allowed to just phase through vehicles, right? And your vehicle can't just phase through your men, right? You gotta work around that, right? So keep that in mind. Similarly, infiltrators in general should be deployed in heavy cover. So if you're fielding those, forward observers, if you've got, infiltrator, infantry sort of units, infantry squads, try to place them in heavy cover as much as possible. You want them to get that benefit of +1 to their cover save when they aren't running or advancing. And in the case of something like a forward observer, in an ideal world, on turn 1, he'd be pulling a fire order so that he can be throwing down some, getting ready to call in a shot. And then from that point onwards, it really depends, right? Did you kit him out as more of an assault unit? Did you kit him out as a supporting fire unit using rifles? Did you, how did you build out the squad is going to determine what they do after that. And obviously in the case of the Americans, and for now, some of the minor nations, potential call in 2 potential strikes means that you're going to want to have, a good cover save so you don't have to go down in order to react to somebody else shooting at you. Because people will shoot at you, okay? So in general, try to take advantage of that as much as you can. And then for platoon and company commanders in your Recce transports, the first question is, do you need them? In some cases, you might. So, for example, I've been running a lot of Americans recently. I have really enjoyed putting a company commander in an M3 White Scout car with 3 bazooka teams, because it gets past the general problem of bazookas, which is hitting on 4s and 5s, because you can rush them up so that way when they jump out for another 6 inches of movement, they can be at point blank range, and now they're hitting on 3s on the turn that you jump them out. And if you can get the first order dice on the next turn, if some sort of armored unit isn't gone by that point and you're still trying to beat away at that tiger or whatever, you can give it to the company commander, snap 2, and you can snap all of those bazookas to start shooting again. Now they're hitting on 2s, right? Ideally in the side or something else like that, possibly even in the rear. Might even be worth taking 3s to hit if you can get around to the rear and get that extra +1 for penetration, right? So, like there's a lot of stuff that you can do with that. But there's a good reason to put your company commander in that Recce transport, because you don't want him getting destroyed. You don't want him getting removed. So if he hasn't activated yet, more accurately, if the scout car hasn't activated yet, you want to be able to make that quick Recce maneuver to get him to a place of safety, because he's an important asset, right? Similarly, platoon commanders can also be really nice in Recce transports, but they aren't strictly always necessary. It might be that you have a relatively large unit in a Recce transport, 5-man squad that needs to go in the Recce transport. Maybe you've got a 5 or 6-man squad of submachine gun guys or something like that, and you're using, say, Bren carriers, right? Or using a T20 Cumsum leads, right? And so you only have you're at max capacity basically. Do you need a platoon commander in there? Not necessarily, right? You could have him somewhere nearby, and he gives the snap to and orders the open top transport and the guys inside of it, and then they go shooting off because you're allowed to do that. That could be an effective way of doing it instead. So it isn't strictly necessary, though it can be really nice. The big question is, where do you need those morale bubbles, right? Where do you need the snap 2 actions actually to be? Do you need it every single turn, in which case you probably want to have it with them? Or do you just need to have it there at the beginning to send them off, so that way they can go off and do their work in a reliable way? It really all depends, right? And so that's the first thing I would consider, is just like, so how do you need to kit out the squads that are actually inside of your transports, so that way you can make them more effective? So in terms of matchups, how do things go? Against armored armies, honestly, this is a relatively bad choice for a squad, because your anti-tank options in the actual infantry sections you're taking are probably relatively weak. Or they really add up in terms of cost if you're taking Panzerfaust, for example, on every single squad or multiple squads. Only getting the one AT choice is not particularly great. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's not the greatest thing. And forward observers are not a reliable way. If you looked at our forward observer videos, they are not a reliable way of dealing with armor. So toward that end, like if the opponent's doing armored platoons, especially multiple platoons, and they're coming at you, a Recce platoon, the movement that you get is not going to be quite as useful. Firepower you're getting is not going to be quite that great. It's not the greatest choice. Okay. Against assault armies, it really all depends. It's very iffy, because if you can outmaneuver them, stay away from them, continue kind of winnowing away at them until you're ready to actually move on them and work them down, you can actually do quite well against an assault army, right? The benefit of the Recce platoons is that if somebody's attempting a charge against your soft company commander in a transport, instead of standing there jumping out of the vehicle and taking the charge, the Recce vehicle, as long as they're beyond 6 inches, can escape, which is really nice. And there's a very high likelihood, even if you're in a relatively slow vehicle, only like a 9-inch move, treaded vehicle, you might be able to escape quite easily, right, away from that maneuver. So, like there's a lot of question marks. They could do really poorly against assault because you're paying for mobility, which assault armies kind of like, because they want you to get closer to them. On the other hand, it could make you quite effective in getting away from potential problems. So it really all depends. Flamethrower armies. This is actually a relatively good choice. One, because you can typically begin to Recce away to safety if they're not directly within 6 inches of you when they declare the shot. Now, here's the difficulty, of course, is that people who run barbecue armies are going to try to get their men out to be within 6 inches of you so they can use their flamethrower, right? That's the way it works, right? So just keep in mind, it's not foolproof. It's not completely safe. You can still Recce away from these relatively effectively. There are ways to do it, especially if they're doing barbecue on vehicles, because they'll be more tempted to stay a little bit further back. You can see it coming. You can plan around it a little bit more easily. So it does work. The other big thing, too, about these armies is that they do tend to be highly mobile. So you might be able to take advantage of them and get the drop on them before they actually get the drop on you. It all depends. Against greatest hits miss bag armies, it really all depends, right? Because it depends on what you're accompanying with this Recce platoon. Since they're probably more spread out among a variety of different threats, you might be able to take advantage of some gaps in their inventory that tend to come with greatest hits, or the fact that they only have 1 or 2 of a given thing to try to stop whatever you do really well. And then you can kind of take advantage of that and kind of blow through a bunch of their best units and capitalize on the fact that they kind of went master, jack of all trades, master of none, right? So it really depends, right? They might have enough counters to what you have. They might not. I kind of have to see the list. Against gunline armies, this is actually a pretty good choice because you get evasion while still getting a decent amount of firepower, which is great. And so you can kind of close the line against gunline armies, take away the benefit of the range that they're generally paying for on those heavy weapons, especially. And since you've removed the benefit of the range, now they've kind of overpaid points for what they've got, right? Against horde armies, it really depends because it's an iffy choice. I'm putting down here as an iffy choice because you're paying for maneuver capability, and it may not matter against a horde army because there's only so many places you can go that they are not, right? Because they're a horde army, right? They're maneuvering around, they're moving, wherever you maneuver to, they will have people at probably, right? And so it's difficult to say how beneficial is the Recce rule, right? You may move away from and cause one unit to utterly miss, but that might put you within easy shots from another unit. So did it matter, right? Like, it's difficult to say. It's difficult to say. Against mechanized armies, kind of similarly, it's an iffy choice because it's a mirror strategy, right? Mechanized armies are probably going to have heavily armored transports, quickly dropping out guys, probably with submachine guns, which is exactly what you're doing with this, right? If you're going highly competitive, that's probably what you're doing. A mechanized army might have really good counters against cavalry units or motorcycle units. It might not. So it really depends on what are you supporting these with, because I don't know. Depending on what you support them with, you might be able to put enough pins down so that way you can kind of stunt the mechanized approach. You might be able to blow up some of those transports in advance, in which case you definitely have an advantage when it comes to mobility. So it really all depends what it is that you've accompanied it with. Against mortar-heavy armies, this is a fantastic choice. You really don't have a lot of reasons when you're running a Recce platoon to stay still with very many assets. And in as much as you do have to stay still with assets and they have a chance to be able to try to range in on those, you have the movement to be able to get up within their minimum range and threaten them to encourage them to move instead of shooting, which will reset their ranging in and will, of course, mean that they're not shooting in a given turn, right? I mean, even a light mortar that has to reposition in order to get to a place of safety, one, they're not getting very far. So if you have especially mounted up troops, you might be able to get them. You might be able to catch them. But to more than that, I mean, 6 to hit, like it does technically happen. Doesn't happen that often. At the very least, whatever damage they do with that 1-inch HE template is not going to be the same as the damage you're about to do to that mortar because you got in really close, right? So in general, I think this is actually a really good choice against people who are going heavy into mortars, especially the light mortar spam. And then finally, against skirmish armies, it's pretty iffy, right? Because you might take quite a few pins from a skirmish army. They're built to kind of stay away. At the same time, you're really good at chasing down skirmishers, so them getting away with moving and shooting and moving and shooting and playing the evasive game while still whittling away and chinking away at your units, it might not do that much, especially since some armies have really good counters to most of the traditional skirmish armies. When you think about a skirmish army like, say, the Americans or the Finns, something like that, who's going to be relying a lot on rifle fire, possibly LMG or BAR fire, something like that, they're getting a lot of benefit and a lot of value out of small arms. If you're something like, a Francospheric army, like, say, the Belgians or the French, and you're able to take advantage of the Berlier, now you have a 7-man capacity, damage value 7 plus, fully buttoned up transport that you can give the Recce rule to, that technically has an LMG on it, but let's be honest, LMGs on vehicles nowadays, if that's the only armament that it has, it's not doing very much in 3rd edition anymore. So it was definitely a lot more useful in 2nd edition than it was in 3rd, but it's still really good. And that would mean that an army that invested in a ton of these, maybe really tiny, small rifle sections that get extra shots or, are better on ambush or something like that, you can roll that thing up and be like, sure, go ahead and declare an ambush order. It doesn't do anything to me. It's not going to change anything. And then I'm going to try to put some pins down on you with my LMG, and then this unit's going to hop out. And sure, you can take a shot at them later if you want to. That's totally fine. They're probably veterans. They're going to probably be at point-blank range. We've already put a pin on you, potentially, in which case now the benefit that you have to hit is not going to be all that great compared to the penalty for now being pinned. And so I'm not going to lose all that much. And then I'm going to shoot at you, and you can't go down. So, there's a very good chance we're going to do some damage to you, right? And so being able to headhunt and chase down skirmish armies is reasonable. It's really just a question of how are they doing the skirmish build, right? If they're doing a bunch of like autocannon wielding or light AT gun wielding, small zippy, armored cars, well, that could be really difficult to handle depending on what you built out with your Recce platoon, right? So it all depends. So in terms of your choices that you get in the platoon, what are we looking at? First of all, from an infantry perspective, you can do regulars if you want to. They make for decent supporting fire units, which is great. And again, relatively cheap. You can also do veterans, which is what you would probably want mounted up either on horses or in a transport to really go up and push the enemy. And if that's the case, then you can definitely take a lot of those in this squad. You've got your forward observers. You probably, I mean, like you can do them regular. They'll do pins reasonably. The problem is they're so easy to remove because they're only wounded on 4. So even if you get a good cover save, I mean, a lot of those hits are going to turn into wounds, which is problematic. You can do veterans. They're more resilient. They're more reliable. The biggest issue, of course, is that they're also going to cost more points. In terms of your anti-tank teams, I mean, you're going to, this is a really good way of kind of doubling up on good anti-tank options that you have without having to pay the tax of a heavy weapon platoon, right? Because let's say that you're playing, well, since they're coming out with a new book soon, Soviet Union, right? And let's say that you really love anti-tank rifles, like I do. A lot of people don't, but let's just say you are, like me, and you do. You have to take a rifle platoon, so you already get an anti-tank slot. And so why wouldn't you just take 3 of those AT rifles? And then you could pay for another platoon commander and 2 probably at least light mortars, which is another roughly 50 points, right? And then now you can take more of your AT teams, or depending on how many you were planning on taking, especially if you have something like an order die cap or something else like that, or there's other stuff that you really like to take, you could take that exact same platoon commander. You could take a dirt cheap, inexperienced unit and then start taking your AT teams. And the only tax that would come with that is that you'd now have to take like a 6-man, effectively heavy field car style, 20 point, unit, right? And so if the unit that you're taking is one of those, shirker sort of units or whatever that you can easily field for like 20, 25 points, you've actually saved points on it, right? So like if all you're looking for is the anti-tank teams and you're not planning on taking 12, right? Or something like that, then it might actually be a better idea to take the Recce platoon instead of the heavy weapons platoon in an interesting turn of events because of the fact that the tax is so cheap on this platoon. You don't have to take that much. And then finally, from a transport perspective, the first question you probably need to ask is, do we need armored transports or are unarmored transports fine? For some nations, you don't get a choice, right? Bulgaria doesn't get a choice unless you want to use Axis support for that. I'm just going to tell you now, you should not be using your Axis support on an armored carrier, okay, for Bulgaria. That is not a good choice. There are way more important things that you need to throw into your army to fill very critical gaps, more so than that. It means you're going to have to be careful using those unarmored carriers. But you know what? DV6 transports, if you use them right and if you realistically understand what they can do and how far they should actually be moving up instead of just their maximum movement distance, they can be quite effective. And so, just things to think about. First of all, armored versus unarmored. How much do you actually need? Okay. And then the next question is, do we need the Recce rule added onto them or can I live without it? Because the Recce rule on the one hand is quite nice to have because it means that you can reverse your full amount. It means that you get the ability to, react to potential shooting. Like there are some really nice benefits to having the Recce rule. On the other hand, not everybody's going to shoot at every single transport, every single game. If you've already acted the transport, it doesn't get to use any of those special rules. So, there's a whole cat and mouse timing sort of thing that happens the moment you introduce the Recce rule, and that may not be advantageous to you. So you don't have to put it on everything, but there are some really good choices. I'll tell you now, Recce rules, especially on any sort of unit that's planning to maintain a unit inside of it, because maybe you've got a British company commander and you just really don't want him jumping out ever because -1 cover saves. So keep him in transport forever. If that's the case, Recce rule is really nice, right? So, just keep that in mind. That's, I think, one of the better things to just consider is that. Now, that being said, as you're looking at your nations, there are going to be some nations that are going to be able to take advantage of the Recce platoon better than others. So some nations, they just get better observers. And so being able to take that second forward observer in your army is really nice. This would include nations like Belgium, France, Great Britain, Netherlands, Romania, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Possibly the Commonwealth. It all depends on how they do special rules for that. Are they going to be closer to what we had with Australia or some of the other nations? Are they going to be very similar to the British rules, which currently give you that rerollable call in for your artillery observer? We don't really know. So it's difficult to say, but it could include the Commonwealth. When the Commonwealth book drops next year, we'll let you know, and we'll go from there. Some armies, they get really limited access to Recce. So in some cases, this could be the only access to the Recce rule in the entire list. In the case of like Bulgaria, Norway, and Romania, technically you get those with cavalry as well. But if you want it on vehicles especially, that's your only access to it. And this could be most of your access to the Recce rule in the case of things like Belgium, Finland, France, Greece, Hungary, and the Netherlands. A lot of those armies, they only get like maybe one, maybe two vehicles that get the Recce rule. It's very rare. So if you want the Recce ability, you might need to take a Recce platoon in order to get access to that. Depending on your anti-tank options, some nations, they get more from their infantry AT than others. So, you know, the Empire of Japan, Soviet Union, and the United States, they've got pretty good AT options running around, that have to come on AT teams, right? So like Germany and everybody who can take Panzerfaust, they get really nice options that are hard baked into infantry squads. But from a, just from an anti-tank slot perspective, those armies have really good options. So it might make sense to take AT extras. And if you don't want to pay all the way for a heavy weapons platoon, it might make more sense just to take a Recce platoon instead. Especially if you're planning on using transports to move those guys up relatively safely. And then finally, if your infantry are restricted, so, we talked about this earlier, like if you're restricted to only one rifle platoon, this could be a way for you to be able to maximize on really good high-end infantry that your army might have. In the case of groups like Norway, it might just be the only way, infantry are one of the few things they actually do have in their inventory. And one of the best that they have in the case of their Royal Guard units. So those are just kind of some of the nation considerations that we have. But it shouldn't surprise you when I say I think Recce platoons can be really good. I think there are very legitimate reasons as to why people don't take them. And mostly just comes down to they've got other things they really like. And while it offers the Recce rule on transports, there's a lot that's missing that it could be adding to people. So for starters, there's a couple of things that I would consider making as a change. And you'll find these again in the Zern mission pack. You'll find a link to that down below. The first change that I would make is I would add a few more slots. Okay. First thing I would do is I would add sniper teams. I would allow you to take an extra sniper team as part of this. One, because it's not unheard of for a reconnaissance unit to have a sniper on hand. Two, because we only get snipers in the rifle platoon right now. And the result is it can be relatively difficult to take advantage of sniper teams and be able to use them to their maximum potential. And that's part of the reason why we don't see a lot of sniper teams being used right now. The second change I would make is I would allow you to take a medic, kind of for ditto similar reasons. I really don't think you necessarily need medics in order to be competitive in this game. But if you want to take advantage of medics right now, the only place you can get them is a rifle platoon. And so there's not a lot of reason to take a Recce platoon if it's not giving you the same level of access that you're getting from just taking a second rifle platoon. In addition, and this is where I think the real value would be able to come in, is that I would allow you to pay an extra 2 points per man to add the infiltrator keyword to any infantry squad in those required infantry sections that doesn't already have the infiltrator keyword. Now, notice how this is worded. It just says any infantry unit. So that would include potentially your anti-tank units could become infiltrator units, which solves the whole problem if we don't end up getting the anti-tank hunters unit back for the Soviets. You could take, potentially, whatever the AT options are in your Recce platoon, mind you, as infiltrators. So now you have guys that can help out. Now, they can't take Panzerfaust, at least at present, so there's that. But it means that if you wanted forward deploying units supported by forward deploying anti-tank, this would be an option. Secondly, since we've been moving more in the direction of rifle platoons can only take one infiltrating unit, this would give the Recce platoon a unique niche. It would give the Recce platoon something unique that it's doing. You want to play a large infiltrator style army? Well, you got to take a rifle platoon, take one of those required infantry sections as an infiltrator. Then you got to take a new Recce platoon, and then you can take a bunch of stuff in there. But then if you want to take another Recce platoon, you got to take another rifle platoon, right? And so it makes it so that if you want to play an infiltrator heavy game, it still allows for that build. But it adds attacks, both because you're paying 2 points per man for infiltrator, which is more than a normal squad would be paying for infiltrator. But in addition, it also adds the platoon style taxes as well. And so because of that, I think that would be pretty fair. I think you could still get a lot of value out of it. Again, you're getting a lot of units that would have really good cover saves. You'd have the ability to play a lot further up front, depending on the scenario. That could be giving you the win starting at the beginning of turn 1. right? Depending on how everything kind of works out. But I think that would make this a very unique and useful way to approach the platoon. And then finally, there'd be some nation-specific stuff. So for Great Britain, I would allow long-range desert group vehicles and SAS vehicles with a damage value of 6+ to be fielded in a recce platoon in place of a transport. Okay? So, for example, let's say that I'm taking 5 units. I'm taking an officer, I'm taking 3 infantry squads, and I'm taking a forward observer. That technically under the rules would allow me to take up to 5 transports. Now, in reality, I'm probably not going to actually take 5 transports. I'm probably going to take like 2 larger transports to transport everybody. Call it, again, we're saying we're British. Call it a couple of kangaroos, just because I like kangaroos. It's not particularly fitting for long range desert group or desert SAS, but we're just going to go with it because I think they're cool. Okay. That still leaves me potentially 3 more spots for transports, though. And instead of wasting those spots, what I would allow you to do is take any sort of long-range desert group truck or SAS Jeep or something else like that as one of those 3 slots. So effectively, it becomes something of a second armor platoon as well for Great Britain specifically, and potentially for other nations as we go along. I'm open to potentially the idea of taking like Saharianas there for the Italians. I'm not sure. I'm still kicking it around, and I just don't know that much about the Sahariana and how it was used, honestly, to know for sure. One of my research projects that's coming up, and so we'll see if I end up including Italy in that list as well. But just suffice it to say, it would allow you to kind of do that, but it wouldn't allow you to take normal armor platoon style stuff, right? It would be specific vehicles that you would be able to field within those slots. And so those are the changes I would recommend making. I think if you do that, I think the Recce platoon looks very appealing. I think it looks very interesting. I think it fills a niche that's more of its own. It is very similar to the rifle platoon, but it can't take quite as many infantry, but it can take infiltrator infantry. And it potentially could open up some new vehicles for you to take, which I think could be very cool. So why does this matter? Why are we spending our time on this, right? Is a Recce platoon? Who cares, right? Everybody's having fun with their rifle platoons, their armor platoons, their heavy weapons platoons, their artillery platoons, their engineers. Who cares if they're enjoying time with a Recce platoon? Well, first and foremost, because I think every platoon should have its place, right? And I think metas tend to get stale when everybody's running the same thing. And I think if you give each platoon its own flavor and feel, it gives people reasons to try something new and try something different, which is always going to be healthy for any game. I also think every unit should have a place. And right now, it's just really hard to use things like snipers and medics just because it's so tax heavy to run more than one. And that means snipers can't lock down all the spotters, which means they don't become a very effective spotter tool, especially when you can lock them down with machine guns. It doesn't become a very effective way of clearing out heavy weapons teams or anything else like that because there's so many of them spread out. And how do you make sure that you're getting rid of the ones that really matter? It's just so hard to use snipers right now. And so being able to provide you with another way to be able to use them in a useful platoon that has a lower innate tax could be highly effective. Okay. It also just kind of gives the feeling of a Vanguard and Recon Force a little bit better, right? If we're doing the units that are first up, it kind of makes sense that you'd have more infiltrator in the platoon. But we don't see that. So I think that would be really useful. And then obviously, just more pragmatically, it helps to sell models. It helps to sell STL files. It helps out the community and the industry that's behind the game that allows us to see more and more newly sculpted models and new plastic kits and things like that. That helps to make our hobby experience better and our competitive experience better because we get access to some of the more niche stuff that a company wouldn't say is their highest priority for making things. Being able to sell more models, being able to sell more files just makes things a lot better. So that's my opinion. I think that the Recce platoon can be quite useful. I don't think every army needs to take advantage of it. I think about half the armies in the game probably, there's not really a big reason right now to take the Recce platoon. That's part of the reason why I think that we aren't seeing a lot of it. And a lot of people who are looking at it are like, well, yeah, that could be very useful. Same time, do I need it when I really need some more armor or when I really need some artillery or when I need something else? I think it's a legitimate question. And so what are your thoughts? Do you think that the Recce platoon is great the way it is? Do you think that allowing you to pay a tax in order to take extra, infiltrator on people, potentially any infantry section in your army list, do you think that that's overpowered? Do you think being able to add actual combat attack vehicles would be too crazy, especially for an army like Great Britain that isn't, short on options? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.